Welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Simone Delermy, and I'm one of the faculty members here at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture. We're really excited about our lineup of SouthTalks for the semester. So next week, same time, same place, we have a SouthTalk entitled I Am From Here, Stories and Recipes from a Southern Chef. And we're going to have Vishwesh Bhatt, who is a chef at Snack Bar, in conversation with Sarah Milan, who is a managing editor at the Southern Foodways Alliance. So we hope to see you there. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Maarten Zwiers, who is a member of the faculty at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. He's the recipient of a very prestigious fellowship from the European Research Council and is currently the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellow here at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture. Maarten is the author of the book Senator James Eastland, Mississippi's Jim Crow Democrat. But today we're really privileged to get to learn a little bit more about his more recent research project, which is entitled Raceland, the Ecology of Segregation. So please, without further ado, join me in welcoming Maarten.
Thank you. Thanks, Simone, for your introduction. I just want to say I'm very happy to here finally get a chance to talk about my research. Took some time before I could come to Mississippi. In fact, I was supposed to be here already in February 2021, but because of travel restrictions and all sorts of visa issues, it took a year longer. So Simone, it was great. We had our conversation group, online reading group, back in the spring of 2021, together with J.T. Thomas. The Netherlands was still, or again, on lockdown back then, and we actually had a curfew, so we couldn't go outside after 8 p.m. So then it was nice to have some people to talk to about very interesting things. We talked about banana plantations and the Caribbean and the Anthropocene, so that was really great. Very helpful and insightful conversation, so thanks for that. I also want to thank Afton Thomas and especially Katie McKee, who helped with 1,000 things over the last 2 years, I think, 3 years. DS 2019 forums, giving feedback on writings, helping us find housing, and that's always a hassle, especially when you're abroad and in a global pandemic. So thanks so much for that, and thanks for making us feel at home, Pepri and me. So it's really good to be back. This will be my third SouthTalk. Or brown bags as they used to be called. So this will be part 3 of the trilogy. The trilogy will be completed. Okay, let's start. The defense of Jim Crow segregation was crude business in the US South. After World War II, states bordering on the Gulf of Mexico fought with the federal government for control over offshore oil fields located in the so-called tidelands. At the same time, they tried to keep Southern apartheid alive. In oil-rich Louisiana, the safeguarding of racial segregation was strongly intertwined with state claims to tidelands oil. In a speech to the white-supremacist New Orleans Citizens Council on September 9, 1958, Louisiana State Attorney General Jack Gremillion explained the correlation between these two issues. He said, quote, "We have made numerous trips to Washington and held countless conferences with officials of the petroleum industry and with state and national government, all in the furtherance of Louisiana's cause." He then continued how state officials, including himself, had put a lot of energy in protecting Jim Crow. Quote, "Like the tidelands, segregation is another case involving controversy with the federal courts. And it also seems to be another long, drawn-out case that may take years before final settlement." Segregation was not directly connected to raising revenue, but Gremillion deemed it even more important than state jurisdiction over the tidelands because challenges to Louisiana's racialized social system, quote, "could bring about radical change in education, employment, and other vital fields of activity." Gremillion's address about oil fields and race relations indicates how in the Jim Crow South, racist customs were thoroughly entangled with economic activities, in particular environmentally destructive activities that upheld white supremacy. Such entanglements are central to the research project I'm working on here, titled Raceland, the Ecology of Segregation. It explores the interdependence between the politics of segregation and specific forms of entrepreneurship, trade, and scientific innovation. The project objective is to demonstrate how segregationist ideology not only shaped social relations in the US South, but also business practices and the regional environment. Besides these economic and environmental aspects, I consider Jim Crow segregation as a fundamentally transnational phenomenon that reverberated globally during the Cold War era, and it often followed the rationale of the plantation. Now, in my talk today, I'd like to outline a few aspects of my research. I will start off with discussing some of the case studies that are central to the project. And these case studies often focus on rural spaces, which functioned as theaters of racialized innovation, economic exploitation, and ecological degradation. For instance, oil drilling in the Louisiana wetlands and the development and application of pesticides and herbicides on Deep South plantations. The South of the United States has often been considered a regional backwater, an area out of step with modernity. The Raceland Project departs from this stereotypical view. It applies a different perspective that places the South at the center of US policymaking and racialized innovation in the Cold War period. Southern segregationists employed ingenious and often very devious strategies to keep their racist worldview intact and export its main tenets across the globe, with profound consequences for ecosystems around the world and for the populations inhabiting them. And the legacy of these strategies continues until today, and that's something I will talk about at the end of my presentation about the transnational far right. Yet the rural South has also functioned as a site of resistance, of course, against various forms of discrimination and large-scale, for-profit, monocrop agriculture. Examples of such counter-plantation initiatives are the Fishermen and Concerned Citizens Organization in Plaquemine Parish, Louisiana, and Fannie Lou Hamer's Freedom Farms Cooperative in the Mississippi Delta, which was a grassroots attempt to grow foodstuffs instead of cash crops. And these efforts are also part of the Raceland Project. But let's start with rural spaces as theaters of racialized innovation, economic exploitation, and ecological degradation. In this talk, I want to elaborate on 4 out of 6 of the project's case studies. And the first one is about plantation agriculture and the rebuilding of Europe after World War II. The second case study examines the entanglement between the oil industry and massive resistance against racial integration in the Deep South, in particular 1950s Louisiana. The third case study concentrates on transnational authoritarianism in the Caribbean sugar trade around the time of the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro's rise to power. And finally, the fourth case study addresses segregationist involvement in development and global distribution of herbicides and pesticides and their application on plantations in the Mississippi Delta in the 1960s. So let's turn to the first case study, which explores the rebuilding of post-World War II Europe, especially how agents of the Jim Crow system tried to incorporate Western Europe into what historian Stephanie Rolfe has labeled a global ecosystem of white supremacy. Plantation owners from the US South were very keen on rebuilding the war-ravaged continent because the profit margins of their staple crops, such as cotton, depended on strong overseas markets, just like it had done in the days of slavery. Within the grand scheme of post-war reconstruction, the former enemy Germany occupied a special place for spokesmen of Southern segregation. And this is a famous picture of Dresden at the end of the Second World War. The city was firebombed by the Allied forces. In the eyes of Jim Crow apologists, only a strong Germany could form a white, Christian, capitalist bulwark against the expansion of what they considered Oriental, atheistic communism. And now I'm going to talk about James Eastland, of course. US Senator and plantation owner James Eastland of Mississippi used forceful language to describe Germany as, quote, the industrial heart of Europe and a neutralizing agent between the Oriental hordes, Russian communists, and a Western civilization 2,000 years old. From his point of view, the threat of communist rule was, quote, the first time in the Christian era that the doctrine of slavery has been adopted as applied to the white race. We are abandoning the principles of Christian civilization, for not since the days of Nero have Christians been treated so cruelly by the Soviet Union, a predatory aggressor nation, in the words of Eastland. As an outspoken anti-communist advocate of white supremacy and a big planter from the Mississippi Delta, Eastland racialized containment of the Soviet threat. He described Germany as a defender of Western civilization, Christianity, and free market economy, while Russian Marxism was an Oriental ideology aimed at aggressive expansion and the enslavement of white people. By calling communism Oriental, Eastland automatically triggered time-honored yellow peril tropes stored in the US Cultural Archive. At the same time, Eastland adapted racialized ideas about presumed communist affinities in the African American civil rights movement and applied them in a debate on the reconstruction of Germany. In doing so, he made the defense of white supremacy in the US South part of a global fight for the basic tenets of Western civilization. In this fight, people of color were framed as having a stronger proclivity for Marxism, while whites stood for democracy and free enterprise. Eastland received extensive praise for his Germany speech from all parts of the United States. A resident of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, wrote the following to the Mississippi senator, and I quote, "In condemning the un-American and un-Christian conditions imposed upon the German people, you have the wholehearted support of millions of your fellow citizens." The reconstruction of Germany became part of a much larger attempt to rejuvenate the post-war European economy. The South's support for the implementation of this European Recovery Program, ERP, or better known as the Marshall Plan, was crucial. In the spring of 1947, Dean Acheson, President Truman's Undersecretary of State, therefore traveled to Greenville, a bustling city located in the heart of the Mississippi Delta. Acheson's hosts organized a traditional Southern dinner party for their distinguished guest that night, complete with mint juleps. The next morning, exactly 2 years after VE Day, Acheson traveled north through the cotton fields to the small town of Cleveland, where the Delta Council held its annual meeting. The Delta Council was an organization of planters and small entrepreneurs who lived and worked in the fertile Black Belt along the Mississippi River. Acheson's assistant, Joseph Jones, described the council members as follows, quote, "Most of them have a world outlook and a modern attitude toward agriculture. Cotton remains the main crop, and cotton requires world markets, hence the traditional internationalism of the Delta." It was a typical spring day in the Deep South, hot and humid. A large crowd of farmers awaited Acheson in the gymnasium of what is now known as Delta State University. Since the beginning of April 1947, Joseph Jones had been working on a speech for Acheson about America's responsibility in the reconstruction of Europe. Besides mentioning the leadership of the United States in the global fight for democracy, Acheson instructed Jones to emphasize economic self-interest and national security as well. The discussion of a new role for Germany in the European Recovery Plan formed an important part of the speech. US officials no longer wanted to treat the Germans as enemies who should suffer for past sins, but as possible allies in the emerging Cold War. The audience listened attentively as Acheson stressed the urgency of rebuilding Europe. According to the Undersecretary, the United States not only had a moral obligation to enact such a program, it was also essential to contain the Soviet threat and to secure foreign markets. He said, quote, "It is necessary if we are to preserve our own freedoms and our own democratic institutions. It is necessary for our national security, and it is our duty and our privilege as human beings." Of course, in the Jim Crow South, only whites had freedoms and access to the democratic institutions Acheson spoke about. And there were economic imperatives. More than a third of cotton exports went to Western Europe. The cotton planters greeted Acheson's call for aid to Europe with applause. For farmers in the Delta, it was not difficult to see the link between European recovery, anti-communism, and their own economic well-being. Less than a month later, Secretary of State George Marshall officially announced the European Recovery Program in a speech at Harvard University. But Acheson had launched the trial balloon for the plan in the heartland of the Jim Crow South, where just a few years later the first Citizens Councils emerged. The administration's choice for Cleveland, Mississippi as the site to introduce the ERP underscored the central position of agricultural exports in the program, and it revealed the importance of Southern support for the enactment of the project. Atchison's trip to the Deep South was imperative because considerable opposition to the Marshall Plan still existed in the region. Segments of the Southern electorate, for instance, did not understand why a former enemy should receive US dollars to rebuild its economy just 2 years after the war. Colin Curley, who ran James Eastland's Mississippi office, wrote the following to Eastland, quote, "People do not realize, should we not contribute something to the upbuilding of the foreign countries, it would result in a chaotic condition, and the communists and Russians would be sure to take advantage of the situation, blaming it all on us." Curley also mentioned how cotton exports from the South would suffer if Europe did not receive US aid to revive its markets. Such considerations, which revolved around the interplay between race, anti-communism, and the creation of demand abroad for Southern farm products, were enough reason for many legislators from the South to support the ERP. With the critical backing of Jim Crow Democrats secured, Congress passed the Marshall Plan in mid-1948. And the picture on the right is the harbor of Bremen, also in Germany, and that's cotton bales coming out of the United States being transported to Germany. Okay, let's turn to the second case study, which takes us from post-war Europe and the Mississippi Delta to the Louisiana wetlands. By the end of World War II, the petroleum business had established a firm foothold in Louisiana. The oil and gas industry altered the state's economy, which used to be dominated by plantation agriculture. Plaquemine Parish in southern Louisiana, where the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf of Mexico, became an oil drilling hotspot. Before the discovery of oil in Plaquemine, working-class residents of the parish primarily lived off trapping, fishing, and hunting. The marshlands were full of fish, shrimp, crabs, alligators, and fur-bearing animals such as muskrats, otters, and raccoons. They were also rich in the type of minerals energy companies were eager to mine. Besides the nascent chemical industry in Louisiana, fast-growing cities in the Northeast, such as Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, hungered after natural gas. This increased demand for gas during the 1950s made the construction of pipelines connecting the hinterlands of the South with big cities in the North profitable. A central figure in the Plaquemine oil and gas business was Leander Perez, who ruled the parish with an iron fist from the mid-1920s through the 1960s. Perez was an outspoken defender of segregation. Journalist Robert Sherrill called him, quote, "Dixie's loudest racial hawk, screeching from the damp, impregnable thickets of Plaquemine." As the political boss of the parish, the oil companies could not circumvent him, and Perez was not always easy to negotiate with. He prided himself on providing for his constituents and forced oilmen to hire locals if they wanted to construct pipelines or to drill in the parish. His politics were a combination of racialized paternalism and good old boy networking, which meant that transactions happened in the back rooms through informal conversations. It was more effective to strike a business deal with Perez by talking about cattle farming, one of his hobbies. In general, the oil business preferred to deal directly with officials at the state level instead of trying to obtain leases through the federal government, which was a much more complicated process. The states' rights ideology of segregationist spokesmen like Perez thus dovetailed nicely with the interests of the oil and gas industry, whose representatives feared that increased federal oversight of drilling might threaten investments and profits. The cooperation between the oil industry and the forces of segregation seriously affected the lives of Black Louisianans and the state's vulnerable wetland ecosystem. When the oil and gas companies arrived in Louisiana, they began to dig thousands of miles of canals through wetlands and constructed pipelines for their drilling operations. Energy and environmental consultant Jason Theriot described how oilmen of the 1950s saw, quote, "conquering nature through technological innovation as a benefit to mankind." Most pipeliners who worked in South Louisiana in this early period viewed the wetlands as a wasteland that held little value to the larger public. Like the plantation, the network of oil and gas pipelines represented an effort to bring what was considered to be useless wilderness under control and extract natural resources whose market value bolstered the power of oilmen and their segregationist allies. Plantation structures also manifested themselves in other Gulf Coast industries, for instance, the oystering business, which increased in scale during Perez's reign. An African-American oysterman who worked in Plaquemine said the big oyster companies were, quote, industrializing Mother Nature, and that they transformed the bayous into, quote, plantations. Like enslaved workers and later sharecroppers who picked cotton, oyster catchers were rewarded by the sack. Their wages depended on how much they could collect per day. Perez controlled the oystering business in Plaquemine, and he made sure to put whites in charge of the large oyster boats. They raked in a significant part of the profit, while the catchers had to do the heavy work. In order to escape this so-called sharecropping on the water, black residents of the parish eventually managed to acquire their own smaller skiffs and collect oysters with smaller dredges, creating an independent economic space for themselves and an eco-friendlier method of harvesting shellfish. Perez's regime was toxic in multiple ways. It not only ensured white supremacy through explicit racist practices and codes, but also through environmentally destructive activities that financed his political machine. And this map is a map of southern Louisiana with Plaquemine Parish, and it sort of shows the land loss that has been happening since 1932, and that will happen if nothing is done about it up until 2050. And you can see that Plaquemine Parish is then, most of it is gone. And this image is of Barataria Bay nowadays, so you can see that there's a lot of digging going on to build these canals for the pipelines and for barges to move through. Okay, large-scale oystering and especially the petroleum business transformed the ecology of the parish, turning it into a semi-industrialized landscape that was more vulnerable to disasters like hurricanes because natural wetland barriers had disappeared. By draining the swamp of Plaquemine, oil companies like Standard Oil and Shell directly subsidized the strongman politics of Leander Perez. Segregationist involvement in offshore oil drilling shows how Jim Crow politics literally extended into the Gulf of Mexico. Southern concerns with the Caribbean were, of course, not new. Historian Matthew Pratt Gutterell has already demonstrated how 19th century Southern planters considered the region an American Mediterranean, a transnational space where they had vested economic and political stakes. Gutterell writes, quote, "The sense of Southern exceptionalism coexisted quite easily and naturally with a sense that the planter class shared a common fate with slaveholders elsewhere in the hemisphere, a Southern version of manifest destiny." This idea of a common fate did not disappear after emancipation, but continued well into the 20th century. The fight for the maintenance of racial segregation in the US was closely connected to the continued backing of anti-communist dictators abroad. For instance, the Franco dictatorship in Spain, the Batista regime in Cuba, and Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, even when these regimes lost the sympathy of the foreign policy establishment in the US State Department. Racialized thinking occasionally influenced this support for strongmen like Trujillo, in combination with economic and geopolitical motives connected to the sugar trade, a plantation staple crop grown in Louisiana and the Caribbean. Southern borders transcended the nation state and also incorporated authoritarian regimes in the Caribbean. And the third case study of the Raceland Project investigates the circum-Caribbean aspects of Jim Crow. In a 1957 address, U.S. Representative George S. Long, a brother of Huey Long of Louisiana, explained the transnational hemispheric nature of the Deep South. The speech was a response to Oregon Congressman Charles Porter, an outspoken critic of the Dominican Republic. Long took the floor to defend Trujillo, claiming, quote, "The Dominican Republic had been to us a vital and necessary bulwark against the encroachment of atheistic communism in its diabolical attempt to infiltrate and destroy our nation through our eastern seaboard." The Louisiana congressman had another reason why his colleague from the northwestern state of Oregon had little authority to speak about Dominican matters. Long said, quote, "Oregon lies some 3,000 miles from the Dominican Republic, while that island republic lies only a few hundred miles from my own state of Louisiana. the Dominican Republic means much more to us of Louisiana than it does to those of other great states of our union. George Long's speech contains a number of important hints about how segregationists thought about borders between the US Deep South and the Caribbean. Moreover, travels to the Dominican Republic strengthened bonds between the Deep South and its Caribbean counterparts. Senator Olin Johnson of South Carolina visited the country in 1957 and contrasted the situation there with political instability in Haiti. Quote, "My recent travels through Haiti and the Dominican Republic provide an excellent basis for comparison between two governments sharing the same island, one torn by communistic-inspired instability and the other stable, firm, and well organized." Senator Alan Allender of Louisiana went to Hispaniola a year later and drew a similar conclusion. "What a far cry between Haiti and the Dominican Republic," Allender wrote. "There is no comparison between the two places. The chief difference is in the type of leadership. Haiti has no leadership, and I cannot see much chance for improvement." In their travel reports, Johnston and Allender utilized long-standing racialized tropes about Haiti, and the origins of these tropes can be traced back to the antebellum era, when Haiti gained independence through an uprising of its enslaved population, and slavery in the southern United States began to expand. Long, Johnston, Allender, and other segregationists from the US could relate to Trujillo because of his anti-communism, his authoritarian style of leadership, and to a certain extent his racial politics. The Dominican leader forcefully ran the country as his own sugar plantation and created a color line between Dominicans and darker-skinned Haitians that must have appeared familiar to apologists for Jim Crow. From the segregationist point of view, Haiti was the opposite of the Dominican Republic. Senator Allender, who grew up on a sugar plantation in Louisiana's Cajun country and was an outspoken defender of the Jim Crow system, saw race as an important factor in the differences between the neighboring countries. He described the citizens of Haiti as follows, quote, "The people here are shiftless, which is more or less a characteristic of their race." The Dominican Republic thus became part of a hemispheric Caribbean community characterized by right-wing regimes that were racist, anti-communist, and highly personalistic in nature. Political machines under the command of strongmen controlled many states in the US Deep South, and these leaders often were not afraid to employ state violence to protect the socio-economic status quo. At the end of the 1950s, after Fidel Castro had taken over power in Cuba, this hemispheric cooperation between reactionary authoritarian states in the transnational Gulf South translated into strong US Southern support for reallocating Cuba's sugar quota to the Dominican Republic instead of other Caribbean countries. A staple crop like sugar thus became a geopolitical weapon in bolstering anti-communist plantation regimes around the Gulf of Mexico. Now, for the fourth and last case study, we move from the Caribbean back to Europe and from sugar back to cotton. The antebellum era and the age of Jim Crow follow a ruthless for-profit logic. Making money overrides the well-being of laborers and the environment. This hyper-capitalist nature of plantation agriculture again revealed itself during the early 1960s when pesticides and their impact on human and non-human beings and the environment became more of a public issue. Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring, played a pioneering role in exposing the hazards of pesticides such as DDT and how chemical companies had systematically misinformed the public about their dangers. By the 1960s, however, planters from the US South depended heavily on the use of pesticides and herbicides to combat pests like the boll weevil. They found a spokesman in a fellow cotton farmer, Congressman Jamie Whitten of Mississippi. In Washington, Whitten was known as the Farm Baron or the Permanent Secretary of Agriculture because of his powerful position on the Agriculture Appropriations Subcommittee. Whitten was also a strong supporter of Jim Crow, especially during the heyday of massive resistance in the 1950s and early 1960s. Although the application of pesticides and herbicides does not appear to be racialized at first sight, in practice it often is, especially in a deep South state like Mississippi, where a large impoverished population of African American laborers relied on work in agriculture. By the 1960s, however, the big plantations in the area no longer required a lot of farmhands. The mechanization of plantations that took off during the New Deal and the increased use of pesticides and herbicides in the Cold War era severely diminished the need for manual labor. Agricultural machines and toxics made hoeing weeds and picking cotton by hand redundant. And geographer Brian Williams describes this destructive Cold War racial order of the Deep South plantation as a manifestation of agro-environmental racism, which was harmful to both the regional environment and the decreasing number of often black farm workers who had to work in the poisonous cotton fields without protection and whose vegetable gardens were frequently sprayed with toxics by crop dusters as collateral damage. On the one hand, the intensive application of pesticides was a continuation of a racist plantation system that had been in place since the 1800s. On the other, it was used as a weapon to drive superfluous labor off the land once plantations were fully mechanized. For the big planters in the Deep South, the well-being of their farm products and the profits they made on selling them on the world market was more important than the environment or human lives, in particular the lives of black workers. As an influential representative of this plantation regime of production, Whitten opened an all-out attack on Rachel Carson with his own book titled That We May Live. And this is the cover of it. It's got a little bit of a Hitchcock feel to it. And I find these birds kind of panicky, that they're like, let's get the hell out of here. So this book was an unabashed celebration of pesticides and the companies producing these poisons. Chemical multinationals such as Shell, Dow Chemical, and Monsanto enthusiastically helped to get the book published in 1966. But besides the nascent environmental movement in the United States personified by Rachel Carson, Whitten had another problem: the looming enactment of much stricter environmental regulations in Europe, which endangered the export of US farm products treated with herbicides and pesticides. In the late summer of 1967, Whitten therefore traveled to Europe for a pesticide public relations offensive and to negotiate with Sikko Mansholt, the European Commissioner for Agriculture and Rural Development. Mansholt was a Dutch politician. He's from the north of the Netherlands, which is an area that also has really big farms. He also spent some time in Indonesia in the 1930s, which was still a colony of the Netherlands. Back then he worked on a tea plantation. Then he came back in the mid-1930s, actually was involved in the Dutch resistance in the Second World War. And then after the war he becomes the Secretary of Agriculture in the Netherlands, responsible for sort of restarting food production. And he was also responsible for sort of the increase in scale of farming in the Netherlands. And eventually he ends up in European politics and meets Whitten in 1967. And while in Europe, Whitten also delivered a speech at the International Congress of Plant Protection in Vienna, Austria. His address stressed the importance and especially safety of herbicides and pesticides. After Whitten's visit to Europe, the Swiss chemical corporation Geigy exhibited interest in a German translation of That We May Live, while Shell's international research company in The Hague, the Netherlands, wanted to facilitate a Spanish version of the book. Both companies were invested in the petrochemical industry and the production of pesticides. They feared the impact of environmental activists like Rachel Carson on their business practices around the world. A German and Spanish edition of Whitten's work appeared in 1969, titled Damit wir leben können, en para que podamos vivir. A year later, the Shell branch in Colombia reported how helpful the book had been in convincing agricultural agencies of the Colombian government to rethink placing restrictions on the use of pesticides manufactured by Shell, such as the Eldrin. With the two translations sponsored by chemical multinationals based in Europe, Jamie Whitten's agro-environmental racism eventually reached a global audience. Although the Raceland Project primarily studies the agents of Jim Crow and their global entanglements, it also pays attention to so-called counter-plantation actions, a concept developed by the Haitian scholar Jean Casimir. One of these projects was Fannie Lou Hamer's Freedom Farms Cooperative in the Mississippi Delta. Hamer actually lived close to Eastland's plantation in Sunflower County, where she started the Freedom Farm in 1969. Among other things, Hamer's farm included a pig bank, community gardens, a sewing cooperative, a tool bank, and housing that was affordable to people with low incomes. These services served as strategies to help African Americans who had lost their jobs in agriculture and were evicted from plantation for exercising basic civil rights, such as the right to vote. Freedom Farms offered educational programs and retraining opportunities for those who decided to stay in the Mississippi Delta. As such, the farm was not just an example of agriculture as resistance, but also an attempt to build a sustainable community based on collective ownership. A comparable counter-plantation effort developed in Plaquemine Parish during the 1970s. I already mentioned that during the days of the Perez dynasty, not only the oil and gas industry primarily benefited the white supremacist power structure, but also the oystering business. Because whites owned the big boats and thus controlled the business, it was difficult for black fishermen to achieve economic independence if they did not find an alternative. Although they did not own the resources to buy big boats, they were able to purchase aluminum skiffs and use hand dredges to harvest oysters. With this equipment, the fishermen no longer depended on the big companies for work, they made more money, and they had more flexibility. But the oyster catchers were confronted with several legal obstructions, one of them a 1978 law that forbid the use of hand dredges because of the damage they allegedly did to the oyster reefs. The law led to the creation of the Fishermen and Concerned Citizens Organization, FCCO, which successfully challenged the law in federal court with the help of civil rights lawyers. One of the oyster catchers described how bringing the hand dredge and the industrial dredge, which was used by the big companies, convinced the judge that the former was more destructive to the environment than the latter. And you see the difference in size here on that picture. The oyster catcher said, quote, "We had them in the back of the pickup truck," so the dredges, at the courthouse in New Orleans. "We had them side by side. The newspaper was out there taking pictures. The judge say, ain't no way this is going to do more damage than that there." The FCCO eventually developed into a much broader civil rights organization fighting against environmental racism and discrimination by local and state institutions such as the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. Now I just want to talk briefly about, so the last part of my presentation, talk briefly about the transnational far right today. These structures and entanglements that I talked about, live on. The legacy we see, for instance, in, might call it an obsession of the American conservatives with figures like Viktor Orban, who is the leader of Hungary, a very authoritarian leader, is trying to do similar things as Trump Republicans try to do here in the US, limiting the right on abortion, limiting the rights of LGBT people, very anti-immigrant too. And actually this form of authoritarianism is now being seen as an example for the conservative movement in the US. And I think he was also at this conservative conference. He was one of the speakers together with Donald Trump. Speaking of Donald Trump, this happened in the summer, and this picture below is of a Dutch highway. There was a lot of protest in the last couple of months in the Netherlands because the Netherlands is a country that is very much based on intensive agriculture. It's the second biggest exporter of agricultural products after the United States. And the Netherlands is about the size of New Hampshire. So, and the problem now is that because of all the nitrogen that these farms produce, they have to limit that output. So a lot of farmers will be put out of business. And this has caused a lot of discussion, of course, and also a lot of protest. And these protests actually turned quite violent, that they would set fire, like you would bring bales of hay to the highway, and then they would set it on fire. Yeah, so, and then the fire brigade had to clean it up, of course. And Trump actually picked up on these protests and used it in one of his speeches that now the Dutch government is after the farmers and trying to to take their farms away. And yeah, there's also sort of this replacement theory that the farmers have to do this, so the government will take the land and then will build housing there for refugees. And then finally, so this is actually, these are these protests in the Netherlands. The vehicle with the Confederate flag, this was in The Hague, which is the seat of the Dutch government. It's a Confederate flag, and then there's a flag behind it. That's the Dutch flag, but turned upside down as sort of a symbol of distress. And they also brought some hay bales. I'm not sure if they put them on fire. And then the other picture, my dad took that picture, and so this is also in the east of the Netherlands, a rural area. And I was looking at it, and I was like, "What's going on here?" And I think he made a picture of the boat, but then I noticed the flag there, and so there's not a Confederate flag, and behind it, again, the Dutch flag, and they also have this handkerchief, which sort of also symbolizes farmer life. Yeah. So it's also sort of this appropriation of and use of symbols of right-wing racist rebellion, and they use it in the Dutch rebellion against the government. So yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I forgot one more thing. And I've got a website, so check it out, raceonproject.com, and there's also an Instagram, and yeah.
Perfect. We have time for some questions. Any from the audience to get us started? Yes.
I'm very interested in what you see as the connection between Witten's work with herbicides and his also fighting against food policy at the same time. He's protesting Kennedy's trip to the Delta in '67, and then he's heading off to the Netherlands like a month after that. How do you see those two things intersecting?
I mean, this increase in the use of herbicides and pesticides also happens at a moment that the civil rights movement really takes off in the South and also Mississippi, like with Freedom Summer. And I mean, I mentioned Brian Williams, this geographer, and I think he makes a convincing argument that at a certain point, they start using these pesticides not just to increase production, but also to replace the farm workers, right, and sharecroppers and the hired laborers, because they are no longer seen as an economic benefit, but as a problem to just the socioeconomic situation in the Delta, right? So it's sort of this idea of using pesticides as a weapon to drive people off the land, and also the way that these pesticides are being applied with these crop dusters, that they fly over these fields and there's no, they're not thinking about the vegetable gardens that people have there. So they create this completely toxic environment where it's impossible to live and where you can't grow foodstuffs anymore. Yeah. So I think that sort of connects to also the opposition of people like Witten to these food programs, right? And then his travels to the Netherlands. I did some research in the Mansholt archives, and I couldn't find any documents sort of that to figure out what they really talked about. There's some material here in the archives in the Witten collection. There's a whole series about That We May Live, about the book. And then Witten also indicates, this is gonna, if we cannot convince the Europeans of, to lay low when it comes to these environmental regulations, our exports will be in trouble. So, and that's when he sort of travels to the Netherlands and to other parts of Europe. And he's got like all these people from the US Department of Agriculture with him, and they help him. And so that, I mean, it's not just him, there's a whole system, yeah, behind it, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Other questions from the audience?
Having spent way too much time in the archive in the Witten collection, and probably not in the areas you've been looking, I can report out that he was very much in favor of segregation and working very hard to keep the separate but equal. So not only is he sort of doing that in the agricultural realm, but he's also doing it to support Jim Crow while this is all going on.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, he's an interesting, I mean, he's this whole, because I think he entered politics in like the 1940s, so that he became a congressman, and then he stayed there till 1995, and also the adaptation that he had to do, like sort of after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, that, you know, that's sort of, I think that he started to realize, okay, if I want to stay in power, I need to sort of change at least my rhetoric a little bit, right? Yeah, but this combination, I think that's something that's also central to this project. You know, this defense of segregation, and at the same time also all these other things that they're doing, which are also not very good for society, right? When it comes to agricultural policies that really benefit, again, the power structure in Mississippi, the big planters, and the big chemical companies, because that's something I find, you know, that Dow and Monsanto, but also Shell, which is a Dutch company, very much are supportive of these, yeah, for instance, the book, and also the way these companies operate in Louisiana. I talked about Leon Perez, but there's also all these examples coming out of, you know, Cancer Alley and the petrochemical industry there, and what happened in Norco and Diamond, yeah. So that's all, and then the fertilizers that are being produced in Louisiana, you know, they end up on the plantations in Mississippi. So that's also another sort of interconnected element right there.
I'm curious as to what you found the most surprising. My background's in agriculture. I'm a native Mississippian. The segregated Jim Crow South, supremacy, plantation systems, global markets, none of that's particularly surprising. What, in your research, what did you find the most surprising? And I'm also curious about the question that's guiding, that's kind of the conceit of the project, the nucleus of the project. So what did you find surprising, and then kind of what's driving the research?
Yeah, so I came at this through literature on the civil rights movement, and I think historians who write about the civil rights movement have a much better idea of sort of this global context of what the civil rights movement was part of, sort of this decolonial, you know, anti-white control movement that was spreading across the world, especially after the Second World War, when these anti-colonial movements come into being in countries like in Africa, in Asia, right? And that link between what's happening in the States with segregation and then sort of its global context, that's something I wanted to try to get at. And some work has been done on it, but that's mainly sort of focusing on Rhodesia and South Africa, which is logical because these countries have similar systems of apartheid, you could say. But I always find it sort of this very global outlook that these segregationist spokesman had, and that it was not just about, you know, protecting these white supremacist states in Africa, but, you know, we also have to think about what's happening in the rest of the world. Yeah? And the main question of this project is, you know, Jim Crow was a social system, but how is it sort of globally operating, and how are segregationists try to form alliances that sort of transcend the nation state, and, you know, they go into Europe, and how do they cooperate with people there, right? Yeah. Okay.
I had a question, kind of related, where the focus of your research is on these global connections. And I tend to think of globalization very much in terms of the movement of people, as opposed to, you know, ideas, as is the case. And I'm really interested in what you're doing with the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And I wondered if in the archives you're seeing anti-immigrant sentiments that contradict maybe those global friendships and networks they were trying to foster, just as an example, in the Dominican Republic. And how perhaps they're perceiving these places. Are they perceiving certain islands, you know, I'm thinking Haiti versus the Dominican Republic, as white spaces? Is that, because again, the racial formation in these islands are so complex. not the historic black-white racial binary. So yeah, I was interested if there's anti-immigrant sentiments that emerge that contradict those global networks they're trying to foster.
Yeah, are you then talking sort of migration into the United States, or?
Not even. Just, for example, where they were, I forget the slide, but where they were talking about the Dominican Republic and how wonderful they are in comparison to Haiti. So I'm wondering, in terms of these individuals that are so supportive of that government, are there contradictions in terms of them then being either anti-immigrant or anti-folks that they don't perceive as white, just because places like the Dominican Republic have Afro-Latinos and such a diverse mix of folks, and not that black-white racial binary.
Yeah.
So I'm just almost curious why so accepting of the Dominican Republic.
Yeah. So when you read sort of their correspondence and speeches, they really sort of focus on the form of government that the Dominican Republic has at that point. I mean, Haiti also, of course, has a sort of a dictatorship, but they see this as sort of a dysfunctional form of government, the way Duvalier is operating there. And I think that's very much connected to race. And I'm not sure if they sort of had a grasp of, you know, the complexity of race relations in the Dominican Republic. What they tried to do is sort of really almost try to, you know, put the Jim Crow, this binary system on what was happening in Hispaniola. And they recognize Haitians, okay, that's really black people. And then, you know, and then the Dominican Republic is, you know, more white. And and then they start connecting that to, you know, communism and authoritarianism, and they're just really they really praise Trujillo for his efficiency and that he's being effective in keeping the country running, and the people also under control, and of course that combination with this global context, right? So sometimes they sort of have to bend their own system a bit to be able to think geopolitically and globally about these different alliances that they are trying to create. Yeah.
Thank you.
And another thing with Trujillo was that Trujillo was bribing a lot of these congressmen, so there's also money involved. Yeah, yeah. So that's another element that we should maybe also. Yeah.
Maybe a short question.
Sure.
I was just wondering, I think these 4 case studies are fascinating. You know, I was wondering if there were other case studies that you were considering using in this project.
Yeah, there's 2 more, and so there's one about medical research, and that's about sickle cell anemia, and how this was in the 1950s. I found this archive at Mississippi State University from this guy named McElhenney, just like the basketball, but I'm not sure if they were related actually. But it's and he was involved in the Sovereignty Commission, but he was also doing research on sickle cell anemia, and he tried to link that to sort of racial differences, and that it was, you know, that race is something genetic. So that's another part. I still have to research because I didn't have a chance yet to go to Starkville. And then the last one, which is more eclectic, maybe than these case studies I talked about today, but that's about digging of canals, Tennessee to Bigby waterway, and also debates about giving control of the Panama Canal back to Panama. And all that happened at the same time. So that's the last case study, which is about canals and also the impact of Tentom on the environment in the South, and how, you know, post Jim Crow, how politicians from the South thought about these projects.